What if I told you that a young woman with no political experience, no royal bloodline, and no apparent qualifications became the most powerful queen in ancient history and saved an entire nation from genocide? What if I told you that this same woman's story holds the key to understanding your own purpose and the courage you need for the challenges you're facing right now? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most gripping stories in all of Scripture, the account of Queen Esther, a tale that reads like a Hollywood thriller but carries profound spiritual truths that will transform how you view your own circumstances. This isn't just ancient history, friends. This is a blueprint for bold faith in impossible situations. The book of Esther is unique in the Bible because it never directly mentions God's name, yet his fingerprints are all over every single page. It's a story about divine providence working through human courage, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they surrender to God's purposes. And at the center of it all is a young Jewish woman who would discover that she was born for such a time as this. Let me paint the scene for you. We're in the Persian Empire around 486 BC, during the reign of King Xerxes, known in Hebrew as Ahasuerus. This empire stretched from India to Ethiopia, covering 127 provinces, making it the largest empire the world had ever seen. Picture the opulence, the power, the absolute authority of this monarch who could decree life or death with a single word. The story begins with an extravagant party that lasted 180 days. Can you imagine? 6 months of non-stop celebration, displaying the wealth and glory of the kingdom. During this feast, something happened that would change the course of history. Queen Vashti, the reigning queen, refused the king's command to appear before his guests and display her beauty. Some scholars believe he wanted her to appear wearing only her crown, which would have been deeply humiliating. Vashti's refusal sent shockwaves through the palace. In that culture, disobeying the king was not just disrespectful, it was treasonous. The king's advisors warned him that if word got out that the queen had defied the king's orders, women throughout the empire might start disobeying their husbands. So, in his anger, King Xerxes banished Queen Vashti forever. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. The king needed a new queen, so his servants suggested holding what we might call an ancient beauty pageant. Young virgins from across the empire would be brought to the palace, given beauty treatments for a full year, and then presented to the king. Whoever pleased him most would become the new queen. Enter Hadassah, a young Jewish orphan living in the capital city of Susa. Her Hebrew name means myrtle tree, but she was also known by her Persian name, Esther, which means star. She had been raised by her older cousin Mordecai after her parents died. Mordecai worked in the king's gate, a position of some influence, and he had raised Esther as his own daughter. When the decree went out for young women to be brought to the palace, Esther was among them. But here's the crucial detail that sets up everything that follows. Mordecai instructed Esther not to reveal her Jewish identity. In that time and culture, being Jewish could be dangerous, especially in a position of prominence. So Esther kept her heritage secret. For 12 months, Esther underwent the required beauty treatments. 4 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. But the text tells us something remarkable about Esther's character. When it was her turn to go before the king, she didn't ask for extra jewelry or elaborate clothing. She trusted the judgment of Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the women, and only took what he suggested. This detail reveals something profound about Esther's heart. While other young women might have been scheming and calculating, trying to manipulate their way to the throne, Esther displayed humility and wisdom. She understood that true beauty comes from character, not just external adornment. First Peter 3:3-4 reminds us that our beauty should not come from outward adornment, but from the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in God's sight. When Esther was presented to King Xerxes, something extraordinary happened. The text says the king loved Esther more than all the other women. He was so captivated by her that he immediately set the royal crown on her head and made her queen. Can you imagine the whirlwind of emotions Esther must have felt? One day she was an orphaned Jewish girl living quietly with her cousin, and the next she was the most powerful woman in the known world. But Esther's elevation to the throne was not random chance. It was divine appointment. God was positioning her for a purpose she couldn't yet see. Sometimes in our own lives, we find ourselves in situations we never planned or expected. We might wonder why we're where we are, why certain doors have opened while others have closed. The story of Esther reminds us that God's providence often works in ways we don't immediately understand. Now, while Esther was adjusting to palace life, her cousin Mordecai continued working at the king's gate. One day he overheard a plot to assassinate King Xerxes. Two of the king's officers were planning to kill him. Mordecai immediately reported this to Queen Esther, who then informed the king and gave credit to Mordecai. The two conspirators were executed, and Mordecai's good deed was recorded in the royal chronicles. This might seem like a small detail, but it's actually crucial to what happens later. God was already setting up the pieces on the chessboard for what was to come. Sometimes our faithfulness in small things, our integrity when no one is watching, becomes the foundation for God's greater purposes in our lives. After these events, King Xerxes promoted a man named Haman to be his highest official. All the royal officials were required to kneel and pay honor to Haman whenever he passed by. But Mordecai refused to bow down. Day after day, the other officials urged Mordecai to comply, but he would not kneel before Haman. Why would Mordecai take such a dangerous stand? Some scholars believe it was because Haman was an Agagite, a descendant of the Amalekites, who were ancient enemies of the Jewish people. Others suggest that Haman demanded worship that belonged only to God. Whatever the specific reason, Mordecai chose to obey God rather than men, even when it put him at tremendous personal risk. When Haman realized that Mordecai would not bow to him, he was furious. But his anger didn't stop with just wanting to punish Mordecai. When Haman learned that Mordecai was Jewish, he decided to destroy all the Jewish people throughout the entire Persian Empire. His hatred had grown into genocidal rage. Haman approached King Xerxes with a carefully crafted lie. He told the king there was a certain people scattered throughout the empire who kept themselves separate, who didn't obey the king's laws, and who were not in the king's best interest to tolerate. He offered to pay 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury if the king would issue a decree to destroy these people. Think about the magnitude of what Haman was proposing. 10,000 talents of silver was an astronomical sum, equivalent to about 2/3 of the annual revenue of the entire Persian Empire. Haman was so consumed with hatred that he was willing to bankrupt himself to see the Jewish people destroyed. King Xerxes, without even asking who these people were or investigating Haman's claims, gave him his signet ring and told him to do whatever he thought best. The decree was written and sealed with the king's ring, making it irrevocable according to Persian law. The edict stated that on the 13th day of the 12th month, all Jews throughout the empire, young and old, women and children, were to be killed and their property seized. Can you imagine the terror that swept through Jewish communities when this decree was announced? Families who had lived peacefully for generations suddenly faced annihilation. It was a moment that seemed to herald the end of God's chosen people. When Mordecai learned about the decree, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. He positioned himself at the king's gate because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter. Throughout the empire there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Queen Esther's servants told her about Mordecai's public display of grief, and she was deeply distressed. She sent clothes for him to wear instead of his sackcloth, but he refused them. So Esther sent one of the king's eunuchs to find out what was troubling Mordecai. Through this messenger, Mordecai sent Esther a copy of the death decree and urged her to go before the king to beg for mercy for her people. But here's where the story reaches a critical turning point. Esther faced an impossible dilemma. According to Persian law, anyone who approached the king without being summoned faced the death penalty, unless the king extended his golden scepter to show mercy. Esther had not been called to see the king for 30 days. Going to him uninvited could cost her life, but not going could cost the lives of her entire people. Esther sent this message back to Mordecai explaining her predicament. She was caught between two potential death sentences, and humanly speaking, there seemed to be no good option. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Where every choice seems wrong, where you feel trapped between bad and worse? But then Mordecai sent back a response that contains some of the most powerful words in all of Scripture. He said to Esther, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Those words, "for such a time as this," have echoed through history. Mordecai was helping Esther see that her position was not an accident or a stroke of luck. She had been placed in the palace by divine providence for this exact moment. Her beauty, her favor with the king, her access to power, all of it had been preparation for this crisis. Mordecai also reminded Esther of a profound spiritual truth. God's purposes will be accomplished whether we participate or not. If she chose to remain silent, deliverance would come from another source, but she would miss the opportunity to be part of God's plan. Our obedience doesn't determine whether God's will happens, but it determines whether we get to experience the joy of being His instruments. This principle applies to our lives today. When God calls us to take a stand, to speak up for justice, to step out in faith, He's not asking because He needs us. He's inviting us to participate in His work. We can choose to be part of the solution or remain on the sidelines, but God's purposes will move forward either way. Esther's response to Mordecai's challenge reveals the transformation that had taken place in her heart. She said, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Notice the progression in Esther's thinking. She moved from fear to faith, from self-preservation to self-sacrifice, from hiding her identity to embracing her destiny. But she didn't make this decision alone or in haste. She called for 3 days of fasting and prayer, seeking God's guidance and strength for what lay ahead. The phrase, "if I perish," wasn't fatalistic resignation. It was courageous surrender to God's will. Esther had counted the cost and decided that some things were worth dying for. The survival of her people was more important than her personal safety. This echoes Jesus' words in John 15:13. "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." For 3 days, Esther and all the Jews in the capital fasted and prayed. This wasn't just skipping meals. It was entering into spiritual warfare through prayer and seeking God's favor for an impossible situation. Sometimes the battles we face can't be won through human effort or clever strategies. They require divine intervention, which comes through earnest prayer and fasting. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, facing the king's hall. Picture this moment. A young woman having fasted for 3 days, walking into a potentially deadly situation, wearing her most beautiful garments, trusting that God would make a way where there seemed to be no way. When King Xerxes saw Queen Esther standing in the court, something miraculous happened. Instead of ordering her execution for approaching without permission, he was pleased with her and extended his golden scepter. The text says Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, and the king asked what she wanted, promising to give her up to half his kingdom. But here's where Esther's wisdom shines through. Instead of immediately blurting out her request, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet she had prepared. This wasn't delay tactics or manipulation. It was strategic thinking guided by divine wisdom. Sometimes God's answer to our prayers isn't immediate action, but patient preparation. At the first banquet, when the king again asked what she wanted, Esther invited him and Haman to another banquet the next day, promising to reveal her request then. This second invitation inflated Haman's ego even more. He thought he was being honored above all others by being the only one invited to dine with the king and queen. That night, Haman went home boasting to his wife and friends about his wealth, his position, and his special access to the royal couple. But then his mood darkened when he mentioned that all his success meant nothing to him as long as Mordecai the Jew remained alive and refused to bow to him. His wife and friends suggested he build a gallows 75 feet high and ask the king's permission to hang Mordecai on it the next morning. The irony here is breathtaking. While Haman was plotting Mordecai's death, God was plotting Haman's downfall. That same night, King Xerxes couldn't sleep, so he ordered that the royal chronicles be read to him. Of all the records that could have been read, the servants read about Mordecai's discovery of the assassination plot and how he had saved the king's life. When the king asked what honor had been given to Mordecai for this service, he was told that nothing had been done. At that very moment, Haman arrived at the palace early, planning to ask permission to hang Mordecai. But before he could make his request, the king asked him what should be done for a man the king wanted to honor. Thinking the king wanted to honor him, Haman suggested the highest honors possible. Have the man wear the king's robes and crown, put him on the king's horse, and have one of the king's most noble princes lead him through the city proclaiming his honor. Imagine Haman's shock when the king told him to do exactly that for Mordecai the Jew. So Haman, who had planned to hang Mordecai that morning, instead had to dress him in royal robes and lead him through the streets proclaiming his honor. The hunter had become the hunted. God's justice was beginning to unfold in ways no human could have orchestrated. That evening, Haman rushed to the second banquet, probably still reeling from the morning's humiliation. When King Xerxes again asked Queen Esther for her request, she finally revealed her true petition. She begged for her life and the lives of her people, explaining that they had been sold for destruction. The king was astonished and asked who would dare to do such a thing. Esther pointed to Haman and declared, "An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman." Suddenly everything became clear to the king. He realized he had been manipulated into authorizing genocide against his own queen's people. In his fury, the king stormed out to the palace garden. Haman, realizing his life was in danger, fell on the couch where Esther was reclining to beg for mercy. When the king returned and saw Haman on the couch with his wife, he interpreted it as an assault and ordered Haman's immediate execution. Haman was hanged on the very gallows he had built for Mordecai. But the story wasn't over. Because Persian law stated that a royal decree sealed with the king's ring could not be revoked, the order to destroy the Jews was still in effect. So King Xerxes issued a new decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves and to destroy any armed force that might attack them. On the day that had been appointed for their destruction, The Jews instead defended themselves and were victorious over their enemies. They killed 75,000 of those who hated them, including Haman's 10 sons. The day of intended mourning became a day of celebration, which Jews still commemorate today in the festival of Purim. Mordecai was promoted to second in command in the kingdom, and Queen Esther continued to use her influence to protect and prosper her people. The orphaned Jewish girl had become not just a queen, but a deliverer of her nation. So what can we learn from Esther's incredible story? How does this ancient account speak to our lives today? First, we learn that God positions us strategically for his purposes. Esther didn't seek to become queen for her own glory or ambition. God placed her there for a specific moment of need. In our own lives, we might find ourselves in positions, relationships, or circumstances that seem random. But God may be positioning us for purposes we haven't yet discovered. Romans 8:28 reminds us that God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Second, we see that courage is not the absence of fear, but obedience in spite of fear. Esther was terrified when she realized what she needed to do. She could have hidden behind her position, remaining silent and hoping someone else would solve the problem. But true courage means doing what's right even when we're afraid. 2 Timothy 1:7 tells us that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and sound judgment. Third, Esther's story teaches us the power of seeking God through prayer and fasting before making important decisions. When faced with her crisis, Esther didn't react immediately. She called for 3 days of prayer and fasting, seeking God's guidance and strength. In our fast-paced world, we often want immediate answers and quick solutions. But sometimes God's best requires patient seeking of his will through prayer. Fourth, we learn that God can use our unique backgrounds and experiences for his glory. Esther's beauty, her Jewish heritage, her position as queen, even her ability to keep secrets, all played a role in God's plan. The very things that make us different or unique might be exactly what God wants to use for his purposes. 1 Corinthians 12:18 reminds us that God has placed each member in the body just as he wanted them to be. Fifth, Esther's story shows us that sometimes we have to risk everything for what matters most. She had to choose between personal safety and moral courage. In our own lives, we might face situations where doing the right thing costs us something significant. It might be standing up to injustice at work, defending someone who's being mistreated, or taking a public stand for biblical truth. The question Esther faced is one we all face. What are we willing to risk for what we believe? Sixth, we see that God's timing is perfect, even when we can't see the full picture. All the seemingly random events in the story, from Vashti's banishment to Mordecai's discovery of the assassination plot to the king's sleepless night, worked together for deliverance. God was orchestrating circumstances long before the crisis became apparent. Ecclesiastes 3:1 reminds us that there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. Finally, Esther's story teaches us about the ripple effects of our choices. Her courage to speak up didn't just save her own life, it saved an entire nation. Our decisions to act with faith and courage often impact far more people than we realize. We might never know how our willingness to stand for truth, show kindness, or take risks for others will multiply through time and eternity. The phrase that Mordecai spoke to Esther, "for such a time as this," continues to resonate today because it speaks to a fundamental truth about human purpose. Each of us has been placed in our specific time, location, and circumstances for reasons that may not be immediately clear, but are part of God's greater plan. You might be thinking, "I'm not a queen. I don't have political power or royal influence. How could God use someone like me?" But remember, Esther started as an orphaned minority woman in a foreign empire. What made her useful to God wasn't her position, but her willingness to surrender her safety for the sake of others. Maybe you're a teacher who has the opportunity to speak truth into young lives. Maybe you're a business person who can demonstrate integrity in a corrupt industry. Maybe you're a parent raising children who will face challenges you can't even imagine yet. Maybe you're a friend who can encourage someone who's ready to give up. You might be in your workplace, your neighborhood, your family, for such a time as this. The courage that Esther displayed is available to every believer through the Holy Spirit. We don't have to face our challenges in our own strength. The same God who gave Esther favor with the king, who orchestrated the downfall of Haman, who turned a day of destruction into a day of victory, is the same God who walks with us today. When we study Esther's story, we're reminded that no situation is too hopeless for God to redeem, no enemy too powerful for God to defeat, no person too insignificant for God to use. The book of Esther never mentions God's name directly, but his presence saturates every chapter. Sometimes God works most powerfully behind the scenes, in ways that might seem like coincidence to casual observers, but reveal his faithful providence to those with eyes to see. As you face the challenges in your own life today, remember Queen Esther. Remember that your current circumstances might be preparation for a purpose you haven't yet discovered. Remember that courage is not fearlessness, but faithfulness in the face of fear. Remember that God positions his people strategically, and you might be exactly where you are for such a time as this. The same God who turned Esther's fear into faith, who transformed her from a hidden Jewish girl into a bold queen who used her surrender to accomplish his purposes, wants to work in and through your life as well. The question isn't whether you're qualified or capable enough. The question is whether you're willing to trust him with your circumstances and step forward in faith when he calls. For such a time as this, God has placed you where you are. For such a time as this, he has given you the relationships you have, the influence you have, the opportunities you have. The question is, what will you do with them?